to strike or not to strike.
To respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike.
Obama can draw a line for himself and for his country, not for other countries.
The U.S., a massive military power with a unique capacity to hit anywhere in the world.
But I believe America is exceptional.
And issuing orders to other nations. What does that make the United States?
Certainly not an empire.
The notion of American empire may be useful propaganda, but it isn't borne out by America's current policy or by public opinion.
What is the future for America?
We cannot acknowledge that we are a nation shaped by history rather than shaping history.
After a decade of wars and occupations, confronted by poison gas attacks and more than 100,000 already dead in Syria, Washington has reached out to Moscow. Has a war-weary America become a reluctant global power?
America's not the world's policeman.
America's reluctance to play a role internationally is a mistake.
And what does that mean for the rest of the world? I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Empire.
That's a red line for us. There would be enormous consequences if we start seeing movement on the chemical weapons front or the use of chemical weapons.
First protests start in March of 2011. They start because teenagers have been tortured for graffiti. At that point, people are marching across the Middle East and North Africa. The Syrians join. They march for 9 months, more or less, without firing back.
That society had already reached breaking point with respect to, electricity, to water, to all those things that sustain life.
So they're getting killed in the streets. The regime is getting more and more violent.
Assad lost legitimacy when he started firing on his own people.
We are all hearing the drums of war around us.
Hezbollah poured in.
Will we help Syria? We will.
Take measures against the perpetrators of this crime.
Egypt is against Western military intervention.
He released an awful lot of the jihadists he had in jail. He wanted this to be between him and violent extremists, and he did everything he could to make that happen.
80 to 90% of the rebels on the ground, or the terrorists, are Al-Qaeda.
And it's very cynical stuff.
The foreign fighter flows into Syria completely dwarf any level of foreign fighter movement that we saw in Iraq.
We are not affiliated with anyone inside or outside of Syria.
If Al-Qaeda works to establish law and justice among the people and spreads religion in the country, then we are with Al-Qaeda.
They are not extremists and jihadists, and the Syrian people would reject extremists and jihadists.
We were 100% sure that the Iranians are involved in killing civilians in Syria.
I think some colleagues jumped to their conclusions.
China is deeply concerned about certain countries preparing for unilateral military actions.
And then, of course, Obama made his ill-fated red line comments.
We start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change my equation.
Our sense of basic humanity is offended.
The use of these weapons have to be responded to.
I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.
Hands up, Syria!
There is a new CBS News New York Times poll this morning that finds the vast majority of Americans, 61%, oppose a U.S. military strike on Syria.
We got to take care of our own.
What chemical weapons? There's been no proof.
Syria is the only Arab nation resisting Western colonialism and Israel.
Saudi Arabia says it will support the U.S. military intervention in Syria.
No matter what actions you take,
there are going to be negative second-order effects.
No one denies that America has the ability to take action and that America can make the decision on its own. The rest of the world can applaud, disparage, threaten, or whine, but no one can force the U.S. to act, and no one can stop it. If one head of state can tell another head of state what he can do in his own country, what does that make the country that gives the orders? An empire?
Certainly not an empire. Not at this point.
An invasion and occupation is the failure of American policy. If we could do it by having collaborators in other places, if we can do it by getting people to sign on to treaties, by getting people to set up free trade zones, then this is a success for the United States.
But that's still different from real empire, which means one country subjugating and exploiting another, which was much more the way the world was organized before the middle of the 20th century.
We know our vital national security interests include supporting our allies, but we also know that vital national security interests include countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
Everyone expected Washington to strike, and strike hard. But instead, there was inaction, confusion, reflection,
on the other hand,
consideration, investigations. Assad was not intimidated. He struck back. His weapon of choice, a TV talk show.
Obama can draw a line for himself and for his country, not for other countries. We have our red lines, like our sovereignty and our independence. Why did the United States fail in most of its wars? Because it always based its war on the wrong information.
War seemed more inevitable than ever.
Remind us again why we have to do this?
The more reluctant you are and the more deliberative you are, the danger is that you can start looking weak.
Bullies and tyrants don't respect weakness.
Oh, right, we have to bomb Syria because we're in 7th grade.
But then, like a deus ex machina, a god coming down on stage to fix things, Vladimir Putin appeared.
On Monday, the president suggested he might support a plan that would require Syria to surrender its chemical weapons stockpile.
You know, Vladimir Putin has pretty much so played President Obama, if I can use an old Southern term, like a broken banjo.
They've been completely incomprehensible.
Diplomacy has been going on for nearly 2 years, and finally came to fruition this week in what seemed a series of accidents, but in fact were not.
The deal got Obama off the hook.
Thanks very much.
Chemical weapons off the battlefield. Let Russia act like a world power. It was a win-win-win. But what about the tens of thousands of Syrians who would continue to die in a civil war? If Assad stays, so do the secret police and the torture. If he goes, what follows? Chaos? Who is responsible? Who is supposed to act? Is it up to the world's sole superpower? What are the consequences if the United States acts? What are the consequences if it doesn't? Joining us from New York on this episode are Edward Litvak, Andrew Basevich, Hamid Dabashi, Karen Greenberg, and Phyllis Bennis. But first, I dropped by the Washington, D.C. offices of the consulting firm Price Hadley Group to talk to Steve Hadley, the former National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. And I started by asking him what interests the U.S. has in Syria.
The United States really has at least four interests in what's going on in Syria. One is to ensure that there is no repetition. I would say this, to impose consequences for the chemical use that Syria has already done and make sure there is no repetition of it. But we also have an interest in bringing to the end a war that has been a humanitarian disaster for the Syrian people, a war that is increasing sectarian and is spreading beyond its borders and risks destabilizing Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey, and a war that is facilitating Al-Qaeda building a safe haven in northern Syria from which it can threaten not only Syrians but the region and the United States. And then finally, of course, this is an effort by Iran through Hezbollah to extend its hegemony. Those are all important U.S. interests, and I would have liked to see a strategy by the administration that would have used a strike to advance and all of those interests.
But one could argue that a stronger strike would actually do exactly the contrary in all these 4 points you mentioned.
That's already happening, and if we do nothing, that's exactly what will happen. More people will die. It'll be more sectarian. We will open the door more for al-Qaeda, and it's pretty clear that Assad is already, during the week of the negotiations, had doubled down. So those are the things that happen if we don't do something. What could have happened if we had done a strike was something that would not only enforce the prohibition of chemical weapons, but would have set back Assad militarily, would have sent the message that this man is not going to win this war. And that, I think, followed by training and arming of the opposition, would have leveled the playing field a bit on the ground in Syria and would have opened the door for a negotiated outcome.
It's been going on for 2 years, 100,000 people died. None of that really happened. I mean, there was some symbolic support for the opposition, but nothing really serious. And now what you're advocating, your detractors say, would something be more of a lethal attack that could lead to a major chaos within the country in the absence of that support to the opposition.
Well, as I say, I would have had an attack. It would have still have been limited. It was an effort to deal a setback to the Assad regime, and I would have coupled it with some training and arming of the opposition.
But have we learned the ultimate lesson, which is that force, military force, does not resolve political problems and certainly does not resolve sectarian issues? It was after the military power was used with such magnitude that we've seen Iraq explode. Aren't you afraid that the same will get worse in Syria as it did in Iraq?
It's getting worse in Syria precisely because we're doing nothing. And secondly,
but how does military force resolve it?
I think the lesson we learned, and people are drawing, that the reason, many people are saying, that the reason there is an agreement on chemical weapons in Syria today is precisely because the diplomacy was backed by the threat of military force.
You don't think the limit of American military force is a lesson to be learned in your last decade or two policy in the Middle East?
No, I think the military piece of what we did in Iraq succeeded. We found a military strategy that did bring down and largely end the sectarian war and did largely eliminate al-Qaeda's
But it started the sectarian war.
Pardon me?
2003, there was no sectarian war in Iraq.
No. My point is that what happened in the aftermath of 2003 was a sectarian war. No question about that. And
thanks to the use of power. Thanks to the war.
Thanks to the use of power, and also thanks to decades of what the rule of Saddam Hussein did to the Iraqi people. What we learned was military power could topple a regime. Military power was not enough to reconstruct a society that had suffered from 3 decades of abuse by Saddam and a war. And the lesson we learned, unfortunately, too well, was watch out for sins of commission. Watch out for using military power when you don't have a plan. But what we're learning in Syria is there are also sins of omission. And if you fail to deal with some of these situations, it can have the kinds of disastrous consequences we're seeing today.
You don't think that there's a schism now between America and Washington? Between what the American people feel and think about their future and their role in the world and that of how most of you folks, the influential ones in Washington, think about what America needs to do?
I think one of the things that various people have said, and I think it's right, is there is a strain of isolationism in America today. We've seen it before in our history. In this case, it's both on the extreme right and the extreme left coming together. And you see that.
Or realism?
You see that coming together.
It's not realism. People realize about the limits of their power and how it should be thrown around in the world.
Well, I don't think America throws around its power. I think it tries to use its power to achieve objectives that are good for the United States and good for the world. I think that we have had these periods of isolationism in the past. They usually come after there's been a war that has ended inconclusively. The question is whether it's a good thing for American interests and a good thing for the world. And there are a lot of people who are writing and saying publicly that America's reluctance to play a role internationally is a mistake, and it is bad for the rest of the world.
But it's a minority view, isn't it? It's a minority view.
You're in the media. You can poll it, and you can see. And the question will be, historically, which view turns out to be right. But I think the one thing we can both agree on is that should America use its power, it needs to be done for the right reasons, and it needs to be done as effectively as can be, and in a limited way that achieves those interests. And that's, of course, what American policymakers try to achieve, and that's what the American people want to see.
To discuss America's policy towards Syria and beyond, we're joined by Karen Greenberg, Director of the Center of National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and Phyllis Bennis, Director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies and author of Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. Phyllis, Karen, welcome to Empire.
Thank you for having us.
So, Karen, I was pretty taken by how Hadley has been dismissive of the idea that there is an American public that doesn't want to go to war, that doesn't like the idea of another Iraq. Is he right about that? Is it just a question of isolationism?
No, I think there has been a growing and somewhat surprising, given our past, American opposition in Congress among the populace to another war. It's been 10 or 12 years of war, depending on how you count it, and it has depleted American resources. It hasn't gotten us any gains. We know now that in a limited war, whatever that is, the American people know that there is no such thing as a limited war, that we don't have control over it, that we have no idea what will happen to the society and to the world at large.
So this is new. This is not just an old isolationist streak in the American public.
This is a learning curve. This is a learning curve. You can tell us once, we know what we're doing. You can tell us twice, we can target something, we have a strategy, we know what the end is going to be. We don't have an end game, we don't have an exit strategy that we've seen work in a way that has brought peace and a lack of sectarian violence.
Phyllis, this schism between Washington and the rest of the country, this idea that the rest of the country no longer trusts Washington, even if they say it's the littlest attack on Syria, it's going to be safe and there's going to be no boots on the ground. They just don't trust them.
No, people didn't believe that. But it was also, I think this notion of a learning curve is very important. I think that what we saw here was an administration that was prepared to go to war in violation of international law, prepared to go to war without the United Nations, prepared to go without NATO, prepared to go without the Arab League, but they weren't prepared to go without the Brits, without somebody to give them some kind of political cover. And when the British Parliament said, no, we're not doing this again, that changed everything.
So it's the British public, not the American public.
It was first the British public, and then it was the American public. It was the British public that led to the presidential decision to go to Congress. It was the American public that forced Congress to be so clear they were going to say no, that the president pulled back when he got the opportunity with Putin to say, there's a better way to do this.
So what's the idea that you can go to war without Congress, without the American people? What is that, imperial presidency?
This is the old imperial presidency. This is left over from the Bush administration. You know, this notion, and we heard it again in President Obama's speech at the General Assembly when he said, I know some of you won't like it, but I'm going to claim American exceptionalism. And it was based on this idea of the legality, the reality, and the power that the U.S. has to go to war, based on that's how we decide we're going to do something or not. It's the Bush notion, as we saw after 9/11, that you either let them get away with it or you go to war. There's no other alternatives. And what we did this time was to pose alternatives for people.
Phyllis, you, unlike Hadley and Obama, and I cannot believe said Hadley and Obama, which is kind of, you know, this complementarity between the two is a bit, troubling.
Power does that.
So he says, or they say, it's legitimate, moral, and pretty safe. You claim it is illegal,
immoral, and
dangerous.
Right. In all those ways, it's illegal because whatever they say about the rights of the sole superpower, there are only two basic reasons.
But if it's illegal, is it legitimate?
If we
As in the case of Bosnia and
first?
Kosovo
Right.
and so on.
It's not legitimate if it's not going to actually work, if it's not going to reduce the number of casualties rather than raise them. I mean, this notion that somehow Kosovo was
talks
legitimate.
about is leveling the fighting field.
Yeah, so that they can kill each other. This was the old line, and this is the current Israeli line about we want both sides to continue fighting, we want them to continue killing each other.
But then they decided last minute, as we were speaking just earlier, because of the British, Obama felt that he was boxed in. And
so he wanted Congress to share it with him.
Yes.
Then Congress got boxed in by the American opposition,
exactly.
The public opposition. But
and the savior was Putin.
But right, on the political side. But I think that we have to go back to the basics, that it was illegal, it would have been immoral because it would have created more casualties, as all the military leaders said. It would not have stopped the war, it would not have prevented any use of chemical weapons by anyone. We still don't know for sure who used them. And it would have been dangerous because as much as the war in Syria is now already, it's spread into at least 5 separate wars that are being waged to the last Syrian. That would have been spreading even further if the U.S. had gone in directly with a direct military intervention.
The idea that there would be no boots on the ground, which is what is said over and over, is not something that many in the military have embraced as a reality. We all know, whether it's special forces, whether it's training forces, Hadley
refers... The first pilot that gets shot down
Hadley
is going to be rescued.
Hadley refers to the fact that we'd have to train after this. Who's going to train? That is boots on the ground. And once we're in, what we've learned from our wars is we don't know how to get out in a way that's easy.
But you've worked a lot on the whole idea of drones and the likes and so on and so forth. Don't you think the whole idea of launching a strike through cruise, which means you're really at a distance from all of it,
you're not
just
that far
beat them up and leave?
You're on ships that are right off the coast of Syria. This notion that somehow we're safe, we're just going to send those missiles over there, somehow over there. It's ridiculous. You know,
and what happens when then they don't accept it? They're not deterred.
What we don't see in Congress or in the White House or anywhere else in the mainstream press, we don't see a discussion of what happens the day after.
Yeah, I think I want to talk about the drone thing a little bit. I think what may have happened inside the Obama administration was that they sold the drone program pretty easily. We're going to have limited, targeted strikes. We know what we're doing. And in a way, I think this gave them the confidence to say, to use the same terminology, we're going to have a limited strategic strike. But this is not a drone strike. This is a military engagement. And it didn't work. I think the second thing, and this brings Putin to the table, is the lack of diplomacy in the Bush administration. Their lack of respect for what diplomacy could accomplish is very much we're beginning to see this now. Putin comes out and says, let's try for the diplomatic option. That's what's on the table now. That's what Americans seem to be supporting. It's not just, you know, an opposition to isolationism.
As we see with Iran, which we had not seen at all, the willingness to talk with Iran, to engage in a serious way, to recognize, and this was interesting, I think, in President Obama's speech, as much as he did talk about the American exceptionalism and the right to use military force, on the particular question of Iran, he was very respectful of Iranian interests, which they've never been before. He recognized that Iran sees the U.S. as the country that carried out this coup in 1953 that led to the overthrow of a democratically elected president and the imposition of the Shah. And acknowledging that, I think, was a very important statement about when you're going to negotiate, you need to have everybody at the table, but you also need to recognize that the other side has legitimate interests.
Phyllis Karen, thanks for joining Empire. We need to take a news break, and when we come back...
I believe America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness, through the sacrifice of blood and treasure, to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all. I believe America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness, through the sacrifice of blood and treasure, to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all.
this time,
I have a deeply held preference for peaceful solutions.
did this mean that there are contradictory impulses in the American soul to rule or at least control the world?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Or to tend its own garden and let everyone find their own way? Is America a reluctant empire?
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Or was this just a swing of the pendulum from hubris to modesty in search of the practical balance point between sins of commission and sins of omission?
What some of the long, bloody messes in Iraq and Afghanistan have done over the past dozen years is to turn American opinion in a more skeptical direction.
You get the liberal interventionists, people who think that the United States can change things for humanitarian reasons or for whatever reasons. Neocons, who have been very, very quick to reach for a gun. Anti-interventionist liberals, libertarians, who are just out-and-out isolationists.
The first argument that America is not an empire is that it doesn't seize territory.
When America came home from these wars, we never asked for any land. We never asked for sovereignty over any other country. The only thing we asked for was enough land to bury our dead.
The other argument is that Americans are just too nice to be real imperialists. Americans thought it was their manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given them. Expansion didn't stop at the water's edge. It was a splendid little war. And profitable too.
With the advent of the modern period, the nature of empires changed.
By the middle of the 20th century, the United States has stopped acquiring territory, but it kept acquiring power.
The United States is the only superpower in the world. It exerts influence everywhere in the world, and the United States has been the dominant force, the leader, supplying the principal sorts of security guarantees, dominating economic rules of the game, and so on.
It has not only interests, but also obligations to the international community.
It's an empire of the mind, and it's an empire of militarism, and it's an empire of mannerisms. It wants people in the world to behave like it behaves.
Still, many would deny that the United States is an empire because of its ideals, that it only fights to bring freedom and democracy to the world.
Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, only as a last resort.
Imperialism was the sudden acquisition by Europe of the new forms of power that came from industrial production, which led the weapons revolutions of the 19th century and the capacity to apply massive force at a distance. I would suggest that what underlies the increased appetite to intervene abroad is the acquisition of new forms of power.
To discuss war diplomacy and America's role as a global power, we're joined here in New York by Andrew Bacevich, a professor of international relations and history at Boston University and author of several books, including his most recent, Breach of Trust: How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country. Edward Litvak, a military strategist and historian and author of several books, including The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, and more recently, The Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire. And last but not least, Hamid Dabashi, professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, and author of more than 20 books, including his most recent, The Arab Spring and Being a Muslim in the World. Andrew Bacevich, Hamid Dabashi, Edward Litvak, welcome to Empire.
Thank you.
These have been two eventful short decades where America was involved in the Middle East and elsewhere militarily. Andrew, where do you place Syria? Between Rwanda, there was no intervention, and Iraq, there was incredible intervention, Somalia and Kosovo. How do you see Syria in the American strategy?
Well, there is no American strategy.
with regard to the Middle East, and there hasn't been for at least a decade. There have been a series of ongoing crises, and the United States has responded to these crises in one way or another, believing that military power is somehow going to make a difference. I've really come to believe that Washington's main problem is its unwillingness to acknowledge that American power really is irrelevant to the events ongoing in the Middle East. And the notion that the United States can control it, direct it, shape it, lead it to some particular outcome is utterly absurd, and yet people in Washington cannot acknowledge that absurdity.
But do you think there would be fear of accusation of neglecting Syria like Rwanda was neglected? Or perhaps maybe they should interfere like they interfered in Libya, where apparently the damage was minimal?
We cannot acknowledge that we are a normal nation. We cannot acknowledge that we are a nation shaped by history rather than shaping history. And again, when an event like Syria erupts, those who believe in the American mission and American uniqueness see Syria as an opportunity to demonstrate how special we are.
So you think there should be no intervention in Syria?
Americans, as you well know, have been intervening in Syria. CIA has been on the ground. They have been arming various groups. Israelis are intervening. Iranians are intervening. I mean, Russians, etc. It's a proxy war already. So suddenly, hoopla after the most recent gassing of civilians, whether or not should the U.S. intervene, it's a red herring. It's just a nonsensical question.
In order for the United States not to intervene, the United States has to now progress to a new status. The new status is that we have to issue one of our doctrines, like the Monroe Doctrine, one of those things, and say that the armed forces of the United States shall not be employed in any area but for the immediate protection of American citizens who are facing immediate peril, or something like that.
So how about
because
then,
otherwise there's a presumption of intervention.
So how about then demilitarizing in order to make sure that not everything looks like a nail in the region?
That would be something that is actually worth discussing.
The point of Russia, the point about making the deal with Russia, you think that is an opening for perhaps a new type of global relationship regarding the United States, or you think this is just a fleeting moment?
Well, my argument would be that the Russians have they resented the way the Cold War ended. They resented, from their perception, the advantage we took of their weakness, for example, in expanding NATO eastward. And so Putin's been looking for an opportunity to poke us back in the eye.
But the decision to go to the Russians, or to agree, and then before that to go to Congress, do you see a reluctant leadership, a reluctant superpower?
Absolutely. You have a reluctant president, because President Obama has allowed a lot of enthusiasts and interventionists to remain in his staff, and he has a Secretary of State, whom we've all discussed. He's an enthusiast and so on. He himself is not. And therefore, he has had a series of retreats. 2 years ago, his retreat was, if they don't use nerve gas, don't use chemical weapons.
The red line.
Yeah, the red line was a way of not intervening.
It was a red line for him.
Correct. And then going to Congress, which was a desperate move, because he asked Congress to vote in a way he himself would never have voted if he's still a senator. Right?
But is this a reluctant Obama, or is this a reluctant power?
First of all, it's a reluctant president, but his reluctance is not a misrepresentation of, if you look, public opinion polls. Public opinion polls are ambivalent, but definitely on the side of 60%, let's say more or less, anti-intervention.
Marwan, in fact, the word reluctance, I don't think is an appropriate word. This is liberal imperialism. They operate with soft power, with covert operations, with proxy wars, with special operations, economic sanctions, drone attacks. This is a different warfare. In fact, statistically, Obama's use of drones is drastically more than Bush's use of drones. It's a different mode of military operations.
No, the fact is that Russia, Mr. Putin, was facing the fact that the Americans were going to bomb his only ally, and that he had no instrument, direct instrument to defend Assad or to answer the Americans or deter them or dissuade them. And then he comes forward with what I consider a brilliant offer, right? And Obama embraces it with two hands, as any intelligent person should have done. And this may lead to some additional cooperation over Iran, notably, because the idea of Americans and Russians going together to identify, locate, remove, and destroy equipment.
Do you think this is more effective than military strike?
Excuse me a second. Any military strike would have been such a disaster that virtually any known alternative would be better, in my view, for all the reasons that have been explained here. But for me, I'm very pleased that the interventionist impulse, this unthinking, unreasoning, unstrategical intervention impulse, was stopped by a variety of things, including Putin's
Well, we agree about that then.
I'm just grateful for that.
Let's move on to disagree about another point. In your last book, Andrew, you speak about how war has become easier once this is becoming more a professional army. It became what you call Washington's army. It was less accountable to the rest of the country, if you will. And certainly with the new technology that Hamid talks about, war has become easier. And if we look at the last 20 years, Syria was going to be just that one last example if it happened or if it happens. So what guarantees are there that America's drive for war is going to diminish?
I think there are no guarantees. And that's where I think one has to appreciate the standing stature influence of what we Americans call the national security state. I mean, that apparatus in Washington, the bureaucracy that is deeply invested into the continuing militarization of U.S. policy. There are people who are making money. There are people whose stature in the government is dependent upon continuing down this
the whole industry
path. So let's take, for example, on the Syria case, we have a pretty clear indications that the senior military leadership didn't want to do it, didn't want to attack Syria for all kinds of prudent reasons. It doesn't follow that the senior U.S. military leadership is interested in reducing the size of the Pentagon's budget, or of rethinking that distribution of bases all over the place that you cited a little while ago as potentially part of the problem. That's again why I am not yet persuaded that the non-intervention in Syria of the moment necessarily is suggestive of a decisive turn in events.
Absolutely. There is an infrastructure of militarization of the globe, not only the globe, into the heavens, you know, into the space,
sure. And cyber and so on.
And cyberspace. And then President Eisenhower's sort of military-industrial complex. There is transmutation of the civic institutions of a democracy into the pegs of a military machinery. That has happened systematically. That there is nothing, you know, evil about Bush, or there is nothing any less violent about Obama. There is something has happened over the last 50 years.
The American nation is not a racial nation. They do not belong to a race called Americans. They're not a religious entity. They are an ideological entity. This is the first ideological state. The fact is that it's an ideological project. And right at the beginning, President Washington, as he left office, said, we have to decide whether our project of bringing liberty, whether it is our duty to also extend it. And the issue, of course, was Latin America, which was then Spanish colonial territory. And right then, there was a debate between Americans who wanted to bring the American ideals to the whole planet.
It is an ideological country.
Yes.
And the ideology, really the cornerstone of the ideology is this notion of American exceptionalism. Correct. We're different, we're special, we're chosen. Everybody else wants to be like us.
Right.
I'd argue that for a very considerable period of time, certainly through the 19th century and probably up to 1945, the ideology actually served the United States very well. It was a source of power and enabled us to expand power, to achieve great wealth. The problem really is...
You mean invigorating, inspiring, and so on?
Yeah, we are called upon to do this. Let's take California. The problem is, in more recent years, in particular over the last decade, and in particular in the Middle East, this ideology no longer serves our purposes.
Yeah,
but we are unable to distance ourselves from it. We are unable to simply read the facts.
But I need the answer following that very particular point. Whether then at one point or throughout or none at all, was America a benevolent empire then of sorts?
Yes.
No, of course not. Of course not.
Of course, yes, of course not.
The purpose of empire is inherently selfish. It is about us. The purpose of statecraft is about us. And I would argue that for a very considerable period of time, partly due to geographic considerations, the resources of North America, the weakness of our near adversaries, for a considerable period of time, we were strategically the most successful country in the last 2 millennia. It's in recent years when we have failed to understand changing circumstances, limits on our power, limits on our ability to understand what's going on in the world, and we are unable to let loose of this ideology and behave pragmatically and realistically, not to save the world, but to serve the interests of the United States.
Benevolent empire as well?
I believe that you have 1943 American troops landing in Italy, and the Italians seeing these Americans, their uniforms that were made of real wool, which they hadn't seen, and these American soldiers giving out cans of corned beef and stuff like that. This was an America that was benevolent in its effects, at the macro strategic scale, and benevolent in every manifestation, applauded, embraced, kissed on both cheeks, and wonderfully well liked. There had been an ideology in Italy, which was the fascist ideology, and before the American troops actually physically landed, that ideology was dead. In the case of the Middle East, the terrain is occupied by a rival ideology called Islam, in its different manifestations. Not all of them are Muslim, like the Nusayris, who call themselves Alawites, and not Muslim as far as I know, but most of them are. It's a rival ideology, and when you come in as an ideological power and you meet a rival ideology, either you destroy it or you stay out.
But has America,
because you cannot be, and that is the fundamental.
But Edward, has America failed to resolve those questions in the Middle East because it's complex? Or has America added to the problems of the Middle East and put...
In Libya, we certainly have added to the problems.
From Iraq, for example, onward. Iran onward.
No, I would say that most of the interventions which have taken place, the 1990 intervention in itself, had been logically followed by next step of going home, then would have been, I think, a successful thing.
It wasn't. It wasn't. We didn't go home. We didn't do what you wanted to do.
It wasn't me.
It was a chapter on a narrative that has led to ever greater.
It was actually the beginning of military intervention. Modern military intervention.
It was a milestone. It wasn't the beginning.
What you're saying
modern.
Post-Cold War. Reagan in Lebanon. The famous tanker war. We intervened in effect on the side of Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
Do you think the intensity of intervention after the Cold War?
Yes, absolutely.
But that ended. The thing is that
ended? You know, during the week of discussion on Syria, there were bombings of Pakistan, Yemen, and Afghanistan.
Of course. But these
are acts of war.
Of course.
Of course. Legally, they're acts of war. But all three of them represent a retreat from the even much more ambitious idea of entering Yemen. At one point, I actually was...
Well, you cannot enter all countries,
You will not believe this. You will not believe this, but only maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was in a room in Washington and practically blew up, exploded, and because the guy was saying the only solution is to go to Yemen and straighten up Yemen. You know, and here this idea that we start economic programs, social programs, educational programs. We deal with the water problem in Yemen and all that stuff. So this is a retreat.
That U.S. military action under Obama occurs on a smaller scale, that we're no longer in the business of invading and occupying countries, does not equal any sort of retreat or demilitarization.
Actually, he could do more. He could do more of it in the future if it's going to be less costly, less boots on the ground.
No boots,
and no one noticed.
Excuse me.
But those at the receiving end of power, Don't care whether it is with boots or without boots.
Marwan, let us remember the stages. Stage one is we're going to change the entire country and its culture. We're going to go to Afghanistan and turn it into Sweden,
We got your point, but the point is we're still waging war in these countries.
Excuse me, I want to go back to the point of legal or not legal, because this is really important, not because I'm a legal scholar or expect anything of you. But when I heard Lindsey Graham, and I hope maybe we can end on this point, when I heard Senator Lindsey Graham say, when I heard Lindsey Graham saying, President Assad did not do what President Obama told him to do. Hence, that he deserves to be more. That approach to other sovereign states, international law in that sense, the post-Second World War order in that sense, did not come out of nothing. It did come out of a place of a logic of sort, whereby we do live in a world where there is sovereign units, and these are called states, and you don't violate their sovereignty
Which means
at will.
This particular empire, Marwan. This is the empire that produced Paul Wolfowitz, who went to national television and he said, we're going to end states. He used the term. These are Leo Straussian thinking. These are megalomaniac.
And what's the alternative to states then?
Pardon me? No. Well, they think that they are the only empire that matters. Whereas the point of this conversation right now is a nation. Sovereign nation state of 21 million, 6 million of which are now dislocated, 2 million refugees outside their country, subject to a war criminal and a mass murderer, namely Bashar al-Assad, who needs to be put on a court of trial by his own people, by Syrians who are subject to his harassments. Nobody died and made United States anything. Going in, it precisely does what you're suggesting, namely dismantling sovereignty of nation states, whether it's 21 million in Syria or 80 million in Egypt or anywhere else, and creating this megalomaniac, huge empire to which only Obama is accountable. But if he could manage his own house here, 300 million, 35 million under poverty line, 50 million underinsured. Public schools are dismantling. There is no public health. If the entire world could become American, so Obama could manage them, that would be a different story.
Professor Dabashi, Professor Basovich, Professor Ludwig, thank you for joining Empire. And I'll be back with the last thought. We at Empire have struggled with this episode and disagreed on the nature of U.S. power that dictates the use of force and about the political brain that produces the thinking behind the use of violence. I can't say after weeks of discussions we've arrived at the same answers, but we've certainly agreed about the relevant questions that beg for answers. Then came Mr. Obama's UN speech that was pretty big on answers that invoke at least 3 more questions. One, why is the American president the only world leader to speak from the UN podium of the use of military power that's not in self-defense and not mandated by the UN Security Council? 2, what does it say about U.S. power that even the most liberal president, a constitutional lawyer, would use American force to reinforce international norms, guarantee the free flow of oil, respond to international terrorism, and hit those who attack Washington's friends anywhere? And 3, if that's not a self-designated world policeman, then what is it? Well, to answer these questions and much more, go to our new magnificent website, and don't forget to follow us or write to us on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time.